Welcome into the Rock Talk studio, where rock and roll books and documentaries are reviewed, previewed, and most importantly, recommended. So if you're looking for the next great rock and roll book or documentary to check out, here comes the good stuff. Like today's documentary about a piano player who came up with some of rock's most iconic licks, and most people don't even know he played on the records, including me. I'm your host, Big Rick. Join me for an exclusive look into what's hitting the shelves and the screens, and get ready to rock your reading and viewing list. And today, the spotlight falls on the documentary Nicky Hopkins, Session Man. And if Keith Richards is one of the first people speaking in a rock doc, well then you know you're in for a good ride. And if it's followed by Dave Davies of the Kinks, and then Mick Jagger, you're off to an incredible start. But did the doc live up to all the hype in the first segment? Well, first off, let's take a look at Nicky Hopkins, the man that they're dropping all this praise on. And honestly, most people probably couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Why is that? I'm going to get to that. But first, let's go deeper into this doc, Nicky Hopkins, Session Man. The film gathers Hopkins' collaborators and admirers to tell the story of one of the greatest session players of all time. Hopkins played on over 250 records. He did what the documentary calls the Grand Slam 2 times. He played on records by The Who, The Stones, The Kinks, and The Beatles. And then he Grand Slammed with playing on the records of all 4 Beatles. And not just played. This is what separates Hopkins from being a session man. And there has been a lot of great session players out there, but it's the amount of iconic riffs this guy has come up with that sets him apart. You've got the Stones' Monkey Man, the beginning of the brush of keys, that's Hopkins. The memorable piano line in the beginning of She's a Rainbow, Hopkins again. The pounding lines in Sympathy of the Devil, he played on 14 Stones records. Both Keith and Mick are in this doc, and they can't say enough about him. Even Bill Wyman is in here talking about how great he is. Hopkins also came up with a beautiful piano part on Jealous Guy by John Lennon and the killer piano solo in Revolution by the Beatles. I mean, this stuff is rock and roll lore. Hopkins just had a way of adding to what was already an excellent recording, and he just made it that much better. Keith Richards has a really cool part in here when he talks about he would have an idea, about half of an idea that he was working on. He would bring it in the studio, and he would count on Hopkins because Nicky would always be able to turn it into a full, flushed-out song. A lot of major players discuss Hopkins' contributions, but I think Richards relied on him the most and gives him a ton of credit for what he brought to the Stones records. Here's some names who contributed and the scope of the participants in this documentary. Wow. I mean, it is astounding, the people that are talking about Nicky Hopkins here. If you enjoy hearing rock and roll legends talking about music, this doc's for you. Other than the names I mentioned earlier, you also have great participation from Peter Frampton, Nils Lofgren, Ben Montench, Glyn Johns, Dave Davies, Pete Townsend, Graham Parker. There is also a bunch of very important clips from Hopkins' wife that really fills in information about what was going on in Hopkins' life during his music career. The documentary is narrated by the actor Bob Harris and uses the on-screen interviews to tell the story. It was really cool to hear from musicians about Hopkins' contributions, and a lot of them, like Frampton, they just really go deep about how Nicky played and what he was actually playing, and it really highlighted his versatility and his intuition and how he could mold himself into any band that he was playing with. I will say that some of the clips look a little public domain-like and at times seemed a little rush. They would throw up some discography of who he played on and what records, and it went by really fast. There was one cut that I had to rewind it because it just went by too fast, and it was a little choppy at times. It's definitely not a slick documentary. But overall, though, director Michael Treen puts together a wonderful story about Hopkins and his playing that perhaps most didn't know when listening to the many of the classic records that he's played on. Nicky Hopkins is one of the best kept secrets of rock and roll, and it's nice to see him get his due in this engaging documentary. And that's really what this is. It's a chance to get a look at someone, an unsung hero really, who wasn't in the spotlight, but made a major contribution to not just a few rock songs, but to rock and roll in general. Nicky Hopkins, Session Man, runs 90 minutes. So now let's take a look at the one big question that stands out about this documentary. I step back and take a look and say, okay, what is it about this documentary that needs to be explored a little bit more? And that is, why wasn't Nicky Hopkins a bigger name in rock and roll? Did you get the November Rock Talk Studio blast? You know, the email that goes out on the last Friday of the month that gives you everything you need to know about the world of rock and roll books and docs, the top 5 titles of the year, the latest announced titles for 2025, and this is a big and, a chance to win a free copy of a book that ranked as the number 2 book of 2024, Robin Hitchcock's memoir, 1967? If the answer is no, I can help you out with that. And it's easy. Just send me an email at info@rocktalkstudio.com. That's info@rocktalkstudio.com and say, Big Rick, send me the blasts and I'll hook you up and enter you in to win the free book. Let's get back to that one big question about the documentary Nicky Hopkins, Session Man. Why wasn't Nicky the focus of this documentary more well known? And I think there's a couple of things, and it's kind of like a combination. But to me, one of the key players in this doc, his wife, Maura, gives a lot of backstory about Nicky, and she discusses his battle with Crohn's disease. And he had this since he was really young, and this made the already wiry Hopkins even more frail. And some artists, when they first met him, didn't think he could even play because he looked so unhealthy. I think his lack of needing the spotlight too, that he had this slender frame and was kind of a shy stage presence, and the fact that he bounced around to a lot of artists is another point that I think contributed to this. I didn't mention this in the review, but he also had a bad drug problem because he used drugs to help him combat the pain from the Crohn's disease. I think the combination of all this, and he never really made a solo record that stood out, that really set him apart as a solo artist. And unfortunately, Hopkins died young at 50 from Crohn's disease and never, until this documentary, had his career and his person celebrated. Allman Brothers fans, I know you're out there because some of the most downloaded episodes of the podcast are the 2 that I've done on Allman Brothers books. And I want to turn you on to the Long Live The ABB newsletter. It's put out by Bob Beatty, who wrote the awesome book, Play All Night, Duane Allman and the Journey to Fillmore East, which won the Rock Talk Studio's best book about a band member last year. You can check out the full review of that book. It goes way back to episode number 10. Beatty puts out the best Allman Brothers content, hands down, and the newsletter is everything and more when it comes to the Allman Brothers. I love reading this newsletter. Long Live The ABB is such a great read. Every time it comes out, I know you're going to like it. Check that one out. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Love talking rock and roll and being able to give you the scoop on a title I think is worth your time and money, like this documentary today, Session Man, about Nicky Hopkins. I hope you join me next week for the last show of the year, the Rock Talk Studio Awards. All right, folks, tear it down, pack it up, and head on down the road. We'll see you next time in the Rock Talk Studio.